Welcome to the Library of Alexandra, where we explore strange books and powerful ideas without pretending that reading them is always easy. Because let's be honest, we all want to be the kind of person who reads every night, annotates beautifully, and understands philosophy on the first try. But life gets busy. So that's what this is. A space where we break down big, complicated books into something digestible, meaningful, and actually enjoyable. If that sounds like your kind of library, make sure you like and subscribe. And before you go, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I love seeing how far these ideas travel. And finally, send this video to someone who keeps saying, I should really read more. This is their sign.
Welcome to another journey on a brand new deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Whether you are prepping for a major presentation, trying to catch up on some foundational psychology, or you are just insanely curious about the hidden labyrinthine workings of your own brain, you are in the exact right place.
You really are.
Because we are going on a truly profound exploration today. We have a stack of incredibly rich source material in front of us, specifically focusing on early 20th century psychological masterwork.
Right, a real foundational text.
Exactly. We are looking at Psychology of the Unconscious by Dr. Carl G. Jung. But we aren't just looking at any version. We're specifically diving into the authorized translation, which includes a profound, really perspective-shifting introduction by Dr. Beatrice M. Hinkle.
It is a remarkable text. And honestly, Dr. Hinkle's introduction alone is a treasure trove of insight.
It really is.
She doesn't merely translate Jung's words from German to English. She essentially translates the entire intellectual revolution of psychoanalysis that was sweeping through Europe and the Americas at that time. It sets the stage perfectly for the monumental task Jung was trying to accomplish, which was bridging the gap between clinical observation and the broader history of human thought.
And the mission for this deep dive is correspondingly massive. Our goal today is to map out the hidden architecture of our minds.
A huge undertaking.
Right. We are going to uncover how your everyday, seemingly random daydreams actually connect directly to ancient mythology. We are going to investigate the dramatic historical schism between Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung,
Which is fascinating.
which completely shaped the next century of psychology. And to tie all these abstract concepts into reality, we are going to deeply analyze a fascinating real-life case study provided in the text.
The Miss Miller case.
Yes, the visions and poetry of an American woman known as Miss Miller. Through her story, we are going to reveal how our unacknowledged desires secretly write the scripts of our entire lives.
It's going to be quite a journey.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because right out of the gate in her introduction, Dr. Hinkle introduces a startling idea.
Yeah.
She suggests that psychoanalysis is essentially like surgery for the soul.
Surgery for the soul. That analogy is incredibly powerful.
It's a concept she uses to explain exactly how we heal hidden psychic wounds. Right?
Exactly. Particularly when you place it in the context of the early 1900s. Think about the history of physical medicine. Before modern surgical techniques, before asepsis, before anesthesia, before we really understood the anatomical mechanics of helping the physical body heal, nature was the only physician.
And nature can be pretty brutal.
Oh, incredibly brutal. If someone suffered a severe physical wound, say a mangled leg, nature would eventually close that wound up. But it would do so with a hideous, thick scar.
Right.
It might result in a highly distorted, crippled limb. The person might technically survive the trauma, but their function would be permanently severely impaired.
They carry that burden forever.
They would carry the visible and functional burden of that trauma for the rest of their lives. Surgery, as it developed over centuries, was science finally finding a way to cooperate with nature. It allowed healing to happen with the least possible loss of function and form.
I think Hinkle makes a brilliant point here. While humanity spent centuries perfecting this delicate cooperation for the physical body, we almost completely ignored the mind.
You really did.
We essentially left the invisible wounds of the soul, the deep psychological traumas that halt our development as fully realized personalities, entirely to the realms of religion, philosophy, and vague metaphysics.
Yeah, the attitude was basically just deal with it.
Exactly. If you had a mental wound, you were just expected to prey on it or ignore it entirely.
Which meant the mind was left to heal itself in the exact same primitive, brutal way that nature heals a broken bone without a splint.
Just patching things together.
Right. Without precise psychological tools to clean out the wound, the mind attempts to patch over its own traumas. But the psychological equivalents of those physical, hideous scars and crippled limbs are our deep-seated prejudices.
Wow.
Our unexplainable phobias, our faulty, self-destructive actions, and our neurotic symptoms. A person might function in society, but they are psychologically limping.
That paints such a vivid picture.
Psychoanalysis steps in as the newly invented surgical technique for the personality. It is the sterile scalpel that opens up the psychological scar tissue to let the underlying infection drain. But, and this is crucial, as Hinkle explicitly warns the reader, this process requires absolute unflinching truth and honesty from the patient.
Which is terrifying.
You have to face your naked soul. It is an agonizing process not to be undertaken lightly.
So the stakes are incredibly high. We are talking about opening up the human psyche to fix what is broken. Let's look at the emergence of this psychological surgery. The story really has to start with Sigmund Freud.
The pioneer of the Vienna School.
Right. Freud essentially shocked Victorian society to its core. He claimed that things like severe hysteria, phantom pains, and various neuroses weren't just random neurological misfires or weak nerves.
No, he said they meant something deeper.
He argued they stem from unfulfilled, totally unconscious desires. And, most controversially for the time, he claimed these hidden desires were almost exclusively sexual in nature.
And that was a seismic shift in human understanding. Freud developed the clinical technique of digging down into the hidden psyche, probing below the threshold of waking consciousness.
Bringing all that dark stuff up to the surface.
Exactly. And what he brought up from those depths was incredibly disturbing to the rigid, repressed moral sensibilities of late 19th and early 20th century Europe.
They did not want to hear it.
Not at all. He found that human conduct is not driven by rational thought, but largely by primal animalistic emotions that are constantly clashing with our rapidly developed civilized mental powers.
And for Freud, this all centered around the libido.
Yes. For Freud, the absolute core of this driving force, what he famously called the libido, was essentially synonymous with a broad definition of sexual hunger and craving.
But it wasn't just the literal act of sex, right?
Right. It included all tender feelings, affections, and emotions that, in Freud's view, have a primitive erotic origin, even if their current expression seems entirely non-sexual on the surface.
But this exact definition of the libido is where the great historical schism happens. This is where Dr. Carl Jung, who was initially Freud's brilliant protege, starts to firmly pull away from his mentor.
The leader of the Zurich school carving his own path?
Exactly. Jung takes a hard look at Freud's definition of the libido, looks at his own clinical patients, and essentially says, no, this framework is far too narrow. It just doesn't explain everything.
What's fascinating here is how Jung completely redefines the engine of human motivation. Jung found himself fundamentally unable to confine the concept of libido strictly to sexual hunger, no matter how broadly Freud tried to define sexual.
You blew the definition wide open.
He broadened the concept dramatically, almost infinitely. He conceived of the libido not just as sexual desire, but as a universal cosmic energy. He heavily drew upon the French philosopher Henri Bergson's concept of élan vital.
Which translates to the vital force.
Right, or the life force. For Jung, libido is the hypothetical, unquantifiable energy of life itself.
So it includes sexuality, but isn't limited by it.
Exactly. Yes, it occupies itself heavily in the realm of sexuality and reproduction, but it is equally present in physical growth, in the drive for nutrition, in intellectual development and artistic creation.
And just general human interest.
Yes. It is the raw living power used instinctively by humans to fuel absolutely all of our functions.
I want to ground this in a modern, everyday example so you, the listener, can really see the difference between the Vienna School and the Zurich School. Let's say you have a career you used to be incredibly passionate about, or a hobby, like playing the guitar, that you used to do every single day.
Okay, setting the scene.
Suddenly, you just completely lose interest. You can barely bring yourself to look at the guitar, and your job feels like walking through wet cement. The job hasn't changed. The guitar is exactly the same instrument.
Right, the objects are identical.
Freud might start digging into your past, looking for a hidden sexual repression or an unresolved Oedipal complex that is suddenly causing a neurotic block against your hobby. But how does Jung view that exact same loss of interest through his expanded lens of the libido as a general life force?
Jung would look at that scenario and say that your libido, your élan vital, has simply been withdrawn from that specific object. The guitar hasn't lost its inherent acoustic qualities. The job hasn't changed its description.
But the spark is gone.
The psychological energy you were actively bestowing upon them, the life force that made them attractive, vibrant, and interesting to you, has been pulled back into your own unconscious. It is like unplugging a lamp.
The bulb isn't broken, it just lacks power.
Precisely. And for Jung, the task of the psychoanalyst isn't necessarily to look for a hidden sexual trauma. The task is to figure out why that general life energy was withdrawn, where it has retreated to, and what new object or internal process it is secretly flowing into instead.
And this fundamental, foundational disagreement over the nature of libido naturally spills over into how they view childhood development, too. Because Freud had this famous and highly controversial concept of childhood sexuality that he termed polymorphous perverse.
He did. Freud observed that infants and very young children derive immense pleasure from their own bodies. They engage in thumb-sucking, rhythmic rubbing. They show a clear, unashamed delight in nakedness and physical sensation.
Which scandalized the Victorians.
Of course, because these actions seem to a Victorian observer analogous to certain sexual perversions seen in adults, meaning pleasure derived outside of standard reproductive acts, Freud labeled this early developmental stage polymorphous perverse.
He saw it as adult sexuality in miniature.
He saw these early bodily pleasures as the direct, undeniable foundation of later adult sexual development. Jung, however, vehemently disagreed with this entire framing.
Jung basically looks at Freud's theory and says, you are looking at a caterpillar eating a leaf and calling it a perverse, sexually deviant butterfly.
That is the perfect analogy, and it aligns closely with Jung's own arguments. Jung stated that it is a massive scientific error to take the complex mechanisms of adult sexuality and map them backward onto an infant.
It's just bad science.
He argued that the early stages of a child's life are strictly and definitively pre-sexual. To clarify his theory, he divided human life into 3 distinct stages.
Okay, let's break those down.
The first stage, which lasts up to about age 3 or 4, is the strictly pre-sexual stage. During this time, the libido, the life energy, is almost entirely occupied with the primal functions of nutrition, physical growth, and basic motor development.
That is the caterpillar stage. The sole goal is to eat and grow.
Exactly. The second stage is the prepubertal stage, where the libido gradually begins to shift away from pure nutrition and into new avenues of social and intellectual development. It shows the very earliest precursors to sexuality.
And the third.
The third stage is maturity, from puberty onward, where the sexual function is fully inaugurated. So for Jung, a baby sucking its thumb isn't displaying perverse adult sexuality. It is simply displaying a preliminary, developmentally appropriate expression of life energy focused entirely on the mouth.
Because the mouth is the organ of nutrition.
Exactly.
This entire debate about the libido completely changes the way we look at why people struggle in their adult lives and why they develop neuroses. Because Freud, in his approach, was almost entirely backward-looking.
Always looking at the past.
Right. If you walked into his office with a psychological problem as a 30-year-old adult, Freud immediately wanted to travel back in time. He wanted to find the infantile sexual trauma or the childhood fixation that was echoing into your present. But Jung flips the script. Jung looks squarely at the present moment.
This is perhaps Jung's most practical deviation from Freud. Jung shifts the origin point of the neurosis. When a patient presents with a psychological crisis, Jung doesn't immediately ask, what happened to you when you were 4?
He asks what's happening today.
Yes. He asks, what is the present biological, social, or practical duty that this person is currently shrinking away from? What is the specific obstacle in their path right now, today, that they feel completely unable to overcome?
So it's about facing a massive hurdle today. And instead of jumping over it or finding a way around it, your psychological energy just hits a brick wall, bounces off it, and starts flowing in reverse.
Precisely. When a person halts before a terrifying or seemingly insurmountable present obstacle, perhaps a failing marriage, a career failure, or a profound loss of identity, the forward momentum of the libido is dammed up.
It has nowhere to go.
Right. It gets stored up, pressure builds, and a psychological regression takes place. The life energy literally flows backward into the unconscious and begins to reanimate past ways of functioning.
Like waking up ghosts.
It wakes up infantile fantasies, childish dependencies, and old desires. And these were completely normal and healthy when you were actually a child, but they are entirely unsuited for your adult life.
And that causes the clash.
These regressive fantasies, because they are incompatible with your conscious adult reality, then get converted into neurotic symptoms. So in Jung's view, the symptom isn't caused by a ghost from the past. It's caused by the active avoidance of the present, using the past as a convenient hiding place.
Let's make this incredibly relatable for you, the listener. Think about your own life for a second. If you've ever felt completely overwhelmed by a current life challenge, say you are going through a brutal breakup, or you are facing a massive stressful project at work that you feel entirely unqualified for.
Or a sudden financial crisis.
Yes, a financial crisis hits,
Mhm.
and suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, you find yourself obsessively nostalgic for your high school days. Or you start spending 8 hours a day escaping into the childhood video games you haven't played in 20 years.
Just completely checking out.
Or you just find yourself daydreaming constantly about a simpler time when your parents took care of everything. You aren't just taking a break. According to Jung, you are experiencing exactly what he described. You're experiencing regression in the fate of a present obstacle.
The energy is retreating.
Your life energy has hit the wall of your work stress or your breakup, and it is actively retreating into the safety of the past.
It is a deeply relatable phenomenon because it is a universal human reflex. And understanding how that regression works perfectly bridges us into Jung's next major theoretical leap.
Which has to do with how we think.
Yes. To understand how that retreating energy manifests, Jung realized he had to categorize how we actually process thought. He breaks the entirety of human thinking down into two distinct, fundamentally different types.
Directed thinking and fantasy thinking.
Exactly. Directed thinking and fantasy thinking, or dream thinking.
Let's start with directed thinking. This is the one we are most familiar with, the one we prize the most in modern society, and the one you and I are desperately trying to use right now to explain these concepts.
It takes effort.
It really does. It's logical, it's conscious, and it is entirely adapted to reality. It's the thinking you use to solve a complex math problem, to write code, or to compose a delicate professional email to your boss.
Directed thinking is essentially reality thinking, and the most important characteristic of directed thinking is that it is highly exhausting.
It drains your battery.
It requires a continuous, deliberate act of will to keep your thoughts on a specific logical track and to force your mind to imitate the objective reality of the world outside yourself. It works almost entirely through language.
Words are key here.
When you are engaged in intense directed thinking, you are essentially talking to yourself in your head. You are organizing concepts using words, which are, at their core, social tools designed for outward communication.
Now, I want to pause here because Jung makes a point that is incredibly important. He states that this highly focused, directed thinking is actually a relatively modern evolutionary acquisition for humanity.
We weren't born doing it.
It hasn't always been our default mode. It is the specific type of thinking that built modern science, engineering, the internet, and space travel. And the text points out that this ability really evolved and was formalized out of the rigorous mental gymnastics of the Middle Ages, specifically a philosophical movement known as scholasticism.
This is a brilliant historical connection Jung makes. If you look at the scholastics of the Middle Ages, think of theologians like Thomas Aquinas. They would spend their entire lives engaged in intense, structured debates over incredibly abstract, almost absurd theological points.
Like the famous angel debate.
The classic cliché is debating how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. To a modern observer, arguing about the physical dimensions of an angel seems like a colossal waste of intellectual energy.
Completely pointless.
But Jung points out that while the subjects they were debating were fantastical and unscientific, the method they used was incredibly rigorous. It was a massive, multi-generational dialectic training in directed thinking.
You're building a foundation.
They were exercising and building the neural muscle of logical progression, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. That rigorous training of the human mind over centuries laid the vital foundation for the modern scientific attitude.
We needed that practice.
Without that historical obsessive training in directed thought, humanity wouldn't have developed the mental capacity to objectively observe and manipulate the physical forces of nature today.
So they were basically doing CrossFit for the brain, using theology as the weights, which eventually allowed us to lift the heavy burdens of modern science.
That's a great way to put it.
But as much as we praise this logical directed thinking, the text provides a really striking, almost humiliating perspective on it. There's a quote included from the French writer Anatole France that Jung references. Anatole France basically strips away all the immense vanity we have about our big, beautiful brains.
He really cuts us down to size.
He says that philosophy, abstract thought, and our grandest intellectual systems are essentially just the perfected cry of monkeys and dogs. He argues that all our transcendent methods and profound speculations are really just primitive sounds of hunger, fear, and love that we've artificially strung together into complex sentences.
It is a brilliant, necessary, and sharp deflation of the human ego. Anatole France is reminding us of our biological reality. He is pointing out that language, the very material of our prized directed thinking, originated millions of years ago as primal animal calls.
Just basic survival noises.
A grunt of fear at a predator, a cry of hunger, a mating call. Our most complex philosophical systems, our treatises on ethics and quantum mechanics, are ultimately built from a system of auditory signs that originally just denoted base physical occurrences or immediate emotional reactions.
It's just a highly advanced alarm system.
Directed thinking, no matter how elevated or abstract it seems to us, is still inherently tied to our biological and social survival. It is, at its root, just the highest, most incredibly complex form of a herd instinct. It is simply an elaborate way of signaling to our fellow humans to coordinate survival.
We are just very articulate primates. And because directed thinking is so exhausting, think about how you feel after 8 hours of writing code, or sitting through back-to-back Zoom meetings where you have to constantly process information and respond logically.
You're completely drained.
You get Zoom fatigue or brain fog. We literally cannot do it all the time. When we hit that wall, when we get tired of directing our thoughts, our minds slip into the second type, fantasy thinking. And this type of thinking is totally effortless.
It just happens.
It doesn't tire us out at all. It's highly associative, it jumps from idea to idea without logic, and crucially, it turns completely away from external reality.
Exactly. When the sheer exhaustion of directed thinking causes it to cease, the mind doesn't just power down like a computer. The engine keeps running, but the steering wheel is let go.
You just drift.
It lets thoughts float, sink, and drift according to their own internal gravity and emotional weight. Fantasy thinking relies almost entirely on images, feelings, and vague impressions rather than strict vocabulary and grammar.
It doesn't care about logic.
It doesn't care about imitating the reality of the outside world. It creates an internal world as we subjectively wish it to be, or as we fear it to be. It deals exclusively with subjective desires, repressed reminiscences, and emotional complexes.
And Jung makes a massive connection here.
He does. What Jung realized, and this is a cornerstone of his entire philosophy, is that this effortless, subjective, image-based thinking perfectly mirrors three distinct things: the chaotic thinking of very young children, the bizarre symbolic structure of our nightly dreams, and the grand ancient myths of antiquity.
That connection is absolutely massive. The idea that when I am mindlessly scrolling through a social media feed, completely zoned out, letting my mind wander, or just staring out the window daydreaming about winning the lottery, the architecture of my thoughts in that moment is identical to the architecture that built ancient mythology.
It is foundational to Jung's work and to depth psychology as a whole. The psychoanalyst Carl Abraham, whom Jung heavily references in this section, formulated it beautifully. He said that myths are a fragment of the infantile soul life of the human race. They are the secularized dreams of young humanity.
And the reverse is true too.
And conversely, the dream is the myth of the individual. Think about it. When ancient early humans looked up at the scorching sun and saw a winged god driving a fiery chariot, or looked at the dark thunderclouds and saw celestial flocks of sheep, they weren't doing directed scientific thinking.
They didn't have the tools.
They didn't have the tools for that. They were engaging in pure fantasy thinking. They were taking their own inner subjective world, their fears, their awe, their biological drives, and projecting it outward onto the incomprehensible objective phenomena of nature.
And the staggering realization is that we still do this. We just do it in the privacy of our own heads, rather than writing epic poems about it.
Wow.
The text is a fantastic documented historical example to illustrate exactly how our fantasy thinking masks our true, hidden desires.
The story of the Abbe Ogre.
Yes, I want to tell this story fully because it perfectly encapsulates how tricky the unconscious is. So Abbe Ogre was a highly intelligent, hypercritical Catholic priest living in the 19th century.
A very educated man.
He was a man of the church, but he developed this absolute, all-consuming obsession with the theological fate of Judas Iscariot, the disciple who betrayed Jesus. Now, the strict teaching of the Catholic Church at the time was definitive. Judas was damned to everlasting, eternal punishment in hell for his betrayal.
No debate allowed.
But Ogre tormented himself over this doctrine. He couldn't let it go. He reasoned, using his intellect, that since God is all-wise and omnipotent, and since God needed Judas to betray Christ in order to bring about the crucifixion and thus the redemption of the entire world, Judas was just playing his assigned role.
That's his directed thinking at work.
Exactly. Therefore, Ogre argued to himself, it would be fundamentally unjust and illogical for a loving God to damn his own necessary instrument.
It is a classic theological paradox. And Ogre became entirely consumed by it. His conscious mind was working overtime, using directed thinking to try and solve this philosophical puzzle.
But it was more than just a puzzle.
But the emotional weight he placed on it was disproportionate. It wasn't just an academic exercise for him. It was an agonizing personal crisis.
Right. It becomes so intense that Ogre actually goes to a church in the dead of night. She stands there alone, and he practically begs God for a physical sign that Judas has been shown mercy and is saved.
He's desperate for an answer.
And in that highly charged emotional state, he reports feeling a distinct heavenly touch on his shoulder. He takes this subjective physical sensation as his definitive divine sign. God has answered him. Judas is saved. And then shortly after this profound, validating religious experience, Ogre does something shocking. He leaves the Catholic Church.
Just walks away.
He abandons his priesthood and his faith entirely. Here's where it gets really interesting, because if you just look at the surface, it makes no sense. But the psychoanalytic truth of the Happy Ogre is totally different.
The underlying motive.
If you take Ogre's conscious fantasy at face value, it is a debate about historical theology. But psychoanalysis looks deeper at the mechanism of fantasy thinking. Why was this specific priest so obsessed with Judas?
Right, why that particular figure?
Because Ogre unconsciously, deeply wanted to betray his own church. He had lost his faith, or he chafed under the restrictions, and he wanted out. He wanted to be a Judas himself.
But he couldn't admit that.
But that desire was utterly unacceptable to his conscious, moral, priestly self. He would have been terrified of the divine consequences of abandoning his vows. So his fantasy thinking took over. It projected his inner, terrifying conflict outward onto the historical safe figure of Judas.
It's brilliant.
Ogre had to convince himself through this elaborate theological fantasy that God forgave Judas. Why? So that he, Ogre, could safely commit his own betrayal without the paralyzing fear of divine wrath and eternal damnation.
It was a permission slip.
His highly intellectual conscious fantasy about God's universal mercy was nothing but an elaborate psychological mask for his unconscious wish to rebel.
It is a breathtaking example of the mind protecting itself. The conscious fantasies we have, the elaborate daydreams or intellectual obsessions we cultivate, are constantly telling us about the deep wish tendencies in our soul that we flat out refuse to acknowledge.
They're sending us messages.
Ogre's story proves that the unconscious is a master dramatist, writing plays where historical figures act out our own repressed desires. And that historical example leads us perfectly and necessarily into the absolute core of this deep dive.
Yes, the case study.
Jung doesn't just rely on historical anecdotes. He takes this entire massive theoretical framework we've just discussed, the expanded libido, the concept of regression in the face of obstacles, the fundamental difference between directed and fantasy thinking, and the idea of the unconscious hiding our true desires. And he applies it meticulously to a real contemporary documented case study.
We are going to look at the inner life, the visions, and the poetry of a young American woman named Miss Frank Miller.
A fascinating figure.
I want to spend some time establishing exactly who Miss Miller is, because she's the perfect, unwitting subject for this. Miss Miller was a young, highly educated American woman traveling extensively through Europe in the early 20th century.
Documenting her experiences.
She actually published a record of her own visions, unconscious fantasies, and poems in a French psychological journal, genuinely believing them to be prime examples of what she called subconscious creative imagination.
She thought she was just an artist.
She thought she was just a naturally gifted, poetic soul, and she even attempted to analyze her visions herself, using various philosophical and literary references. But Jung takes her published text and dissects it, showing how her conscious analysis completely missed the deeper, powerful, underlying psychological currents driving her mind.
She missed the actual engine driving the car.
Now, to understand why her unconscious was so loud, we have to look at her personality. The text spends a lot of time establishing Miss Miller's extreme suggestibility.
That's a key term.
And it's not just that she's a bit gullible or easily swayed by an argument. She actually takes on the physical and emotional experiences of the people and things around her.
She absorbs them.
For example, she writes that she absolutely loves eating caviar. But if she is at a dinner party and someone sitting next to her expresses a strong loathing for caviar, she instantly, involuntarily feels physically disgusted by it.
It physically affects her.
Or, in another instance, she takes a bath, wraps a large towel around her head to dry her hair, catches her reflection in the mirror, and suddenly feels like she literally is a rigid stone Egyptian statue, taking on the posture and emotional weight of ancient stone.
To a layman, she might just sound eccentric or overly dramatic. But in psychoanalytic terms, this profound suggestibility is a vital indicator of exactly how her libido operates. It shows an incredibly powerful capacity for identification.
The boundaries are blurred.
You mentioned the term introjection earlier, and this is the perfect place to define it. Introjection is a psychological process where a person subconsciously takes in the behaviors, attributes, or emotional states of other people or objects and makes them their own.
It is the opposite of projection.
Right. Miss Miller is incredibly quick to either project her own inner states onto outside objects or to introject outside states deep into herself. This means her emotional boundaries, the walls between her conscious identity and the outside world, are highly porous.
He's wide open.
She is a highly sensitive, almost vibrating instrument, which makes it remarkably easy for unconscious material to bubble up to the surface and manifest in her conscious awareness.
The most revealing and tragic example of this porous boundary is her intense reaction to seeing a stage production of the famous play Cyrano de Bergerac.
Oh, this is a crucial moment.
I'll quickly explain the plot for those who haven't seen it because it's vital. Cyrano is a brilliant poet and a fierce swordsman, but he has a massive grotesque nose, making him incredibly ugly.
He's an outcast.
He is deeply, desperately in love with the beautiful Roxane. But Roxane is infatuated with Christian, a soldier who is incredibly handsome, but totally inarticulate and dull.
A classic love triangle.
Cyrano, knowing Roxane will never love him because of his looks, agrees to help Christian by writing brilliant, soul-stirring love letters to Roxane, pretending they're from Christian. So Roxane falls in love with Cyrano's beautiful soul, while believing she is loving Christian's handsome face.
A tragic setup.
Now, Miss Miller is watching this play, and there is a dramatic scene where the handsome soldier Christian is fatally wounded in battle and is dying. Miss Miller reports in her writings that as she watched Christian dying on stage, she felt an actual, piercing, agonizing physical pain in her own breast, in the exact physical spot where the character Christian was wounded.
On the surface level, reading her own account, you would say she strongly identifies with the dying Christian.
Because she felt his pain.
But Jung, applying his analytical scalpel, points out that this physical sensation is a substitute memory or a screen memory. He looks at the structural dynamics of her empathy. If you look at the entire plot of the play you just beautifully summarized, Christian is actually a relatively superficial character.
He is merely the handsome vessel.
The true agonizing tragedy of the play belongs entirely to Cyrano. Cyrano is the man who is ugly on the outside, but possesses a profoundly beautiful, poetic, passionate soul. Cyrano is the ultimate archetype of the hero suffering from hidden, unexpressed, and entirely misunderstood love.
He's trapped.
He is forced to watch the woman he loves swoon over his own words, while she remains completely blind to his actual existence.
So Jung is arguing that Miss Miller's true, deep unconscious identification isn't actually with the dying soldier at all. It's with Cyrano himself.
Precisely. The sudden, violent end of Christian's love affair on stage emotionally resonates with her and provides the shock that causes the physical pain, but the deep structural psychological identification is entirely with Cyrano's misunderstood, unrequited, and hidden passion.
She feels like Cyrano.
This seemingly minor detail of a theater visit tells the psychoanalyst immediately that Miss Miller is carrying a massive psychological complex related to hidden, unfulfilled love. She feels, deep in her unconscious, that she has a beautiful, poetic soul that is going completely unrecognized by the men in her life.
That is heartbreaking.
She is carrying a heavy burden of unspent romantic and erotic libido.
That is a brilliant piece of detective work by Jung. So, keeping that Cyrano complex firmly in mind, we move to the catalyst for her visions. Miss Miller goes on a sea voyage. She's traveling by ship from Naples to Livorno.
Out on the open water.
And in her journal, she describes falling into a deep, almost trance-like state of what Jung calls introversion. She intentionally isolates herself on the deck of the ship. She stops talking to the other passengers. She says the real physical world fades away into a luminous mist, and she just completely retreats into her own mind, her daydreams, and her fantasies.
This is a textbook example of the withdrawal of libido from the external world. She is pulling her life energy, her élan vital, completely inward.
Unplugging the lamp again.
She is unplugging from reality, and clinically, this kind of deep, sudden introversion almost always precedes a powerful psychological event. When you pull away from reality to that extreme degree, the conscious mind's grip loosens and the unconscious mind becomes highly active, pressurized, and begins to assert its own symbolic reality.
And then Reality suddenly pierces through her luminous mist. It happens during the night watch on the ship. A handsome Italian naval officer, who is on duty, begins to sing a song into the night.
The spark.
Miss Miller hears him. In her journal, she admits that he made an impression on her, and she even writes a little lighthearted sailor song in his honor. But then, almost immediately, she quickly dismisses the entire interaction.
She brushes it away.
She writes that it was just a minor, amusing, completely meaningless flirtation, and she explicitly notes that she went back to her cabin and fell asleep thinking of nothing more serious than the beauty of the officers. She waves it away entirely.
If we connect this specific moment to the bigger picture of human psychology, we see a classic, highly destructive psychological mechanism at work: the undervaluation of the erotic impression.
The undervaluation of the erotic impression.
Society trains us, and this was especially true for young, unmarried, proper American women traveling in the early 20th century, to aggressively ignore, downplay, or repress sudden sexual and erotic sparks. The singing officer sparked a genuine surge of her libido.
She felt something real.
But because acknowledging a sudden, intense sexual attraction to a random Italian sailor completely conflicted with her conscious moral framework and her proper self-image, she aggressively brushed it off.
Swept it under the rug.
She consciously devalued it to nothing serious. But as Jung teaches us, you cannot simply destroy libido by ignoring it. Energy cannot be destroyed. If you refuse to spend that energy consciously, if you dam it up by saying, "This means nothing," that potent life energy is forcefully shoved down into the unconscious.
And the unconscious, as we are learning, is not a quiet basement. It demands a reckoning. It takes that energy and does something with it. Because shortly after brushing off this officer, Miss Miller experiences a sudden, mild, physical illness.
The body reacting.
And then while resting in her cabin, she falls into a strange state that isn't quite sleep, but isn't waking either. And she experiences a profound, overwhelming, almost biblical dream or vision.
A massive psychological event.
In this vision, she hears a booming, disembodied voice. She hears mighty cosmic chorals resounding through the universe. And she literally sees words forming on a blank page in front of her, written in her own handwriting. It's a grand poem, which she titles The Hymn of Creation.
This sequence of events perfectly tracks with Jung's theory of regression. The energy from that suppressed erotic impression, the spark from the singing officer, had to go somewhere.
It couldn't just vanish.
Because it was denied a natural outward expression in reality, which might have just been acknowledging her desire or having a conscious romantic fantasy about the man, it hit a wall. It regressed. It flowed rapidly backward into the deep unconscious mind.
And it grabbed onto something older.
And as it retreated, it grabbed hold of ancient mythological fantasy-thinking imagery. It then returned to the surface of her mind, dressed not as a crush on a sailor, but in grandiose, overwhelming religious robes.
Wow.
This is the unconscious violently insisting on processing the energy that the conscious mind puritanically refused to acknowledge.
I want you, the listener, to really internalize this, because we all do it. Think about times you've aggressively downplayed a highly charged interaction with someone. Maybe you had a moment, a sudden spark with a coworker or a friend's partner.
A dangerous spark.
But you immediately told yourself, nope, totally unprofessional, absolutely nothing there, moving on. You threw a blanket over it. And then, that very night, that specific person features prominently in a bizarre, highly symbolic, incredibly emotionally charged dream.
And you wake up confused.
You wake up sweating, thinking, where on earth did that come from? I don't even like them. It came from the exact unspent energy you tried to shove into the basement of your mind.
Exactly.
So let's look closely at the actual poem Miss Miller produced during this trance, The Hymn of Creation. She writes it out in 3 distinct stanzas. In the first stanza, she writes that the eternal makes sound, and the entire universe echoes with glory, praising the God of sound.
Okay, the God of sound.
In the second stanza, the eternal makes light, and the universe praises the God of light. In the third stanza, the eternal gives love, and the universe praises the God of love.
A clear progression.
Now, reading that, it sounds exactly like a traditional, perhaps slightly generic religious hymn you might hear in church. But Jung takes out his scalpel, and he traces the associative chain of these concepts right back to the wooden deck of that ship.
Yes, the psychological association is incredibly direct, even if it is heavily cloaked in grand symbolism. How does the poem start? With the God of sound. Who created sound in the ship?
The officer's singing.
The singing officer on the night watch. He is the creator of the sound that pierced her deep introversion. So, in the logic of fantasy thinking, the officer directly equals the god of sound.
It's a direct translation.
Furthermore, because he was on the night watch, singing into the dark, he becomes associated with morning stars, the heralds of dawn. This naturally leads her fantasy thinking to the second stanza, the god of light, the morning star, the rising sun.
And the final stanza.
And finally, in the third stanza, the true underlying motive that started this whole chain reaction is finally safely revealed, the god of love. The entire sequence of the poem is a step-by-step escalation of her repressed erotic desire, meticulously sublimated into a safe, acceptable cosmic act of divine creation.
But naturally, Miss Miller does not see it that way at all. When she published this, she included her own extensive notes, trying to explain the poem away by citing all these highbrow, intellectual, literary influences.
Defending her intellect.
She was highly educated, so she uses that to defend herself. She claims the poem was inspired by her recent readings of John Milton's epic poem Paradise Lost, the biblical book of Job, and the ancient Greek philosopher Anaxagoras. She's basically throwing up a smokescreen, saying to the psychological community, look, this isn't about a hot guy in a boat. This is deep theology and high philosophy. I'm a serious thinker.
That is her conscious mind working overtime to maintain the censorship. It is trying to build an intellectual fortress around her vulnerable emotions. But as Jung brilliantly points out, the unconscious never chooses its disguises randomly.
It picks those tools for a reason.
It uses those specific literary stories for a very specific reason. She cites Paradise Lost. Why? What is Paradise Lost about? It signifies a tragic fall from grace, the loss of innocence, and crucially, the temptation of the serpent.
The ultimate symbol of desire.
Which is one of the oldest, most classic mythological symbols of awakening erotic desire. Her unconscious chose Milton because it is wrestling with temptation.
And her reference to the book of Job is even more telling. I'll explain Job briefly. Job is the quintessential biblical story of the innocent sufferer. Job is a good, righteous man who is suddenly stripped of everything he loves, tortured by illness, and completely misunderstood by his friends, who insist he must have sinned.
They blame him.
God is punishing him for reasons he cannot comprehend. Jung says Miss Miller's unconscious grabbed onto Job because Job represents exactly how she feels inside. That perfectly matches her deep identification with Cyrano de Bergerac we talked about earlier.
The misunderstood soul.
She feels like the innocent, misunderstood sufferer of her own unacknowledged, hidden passions. She feels tortured by desires she didn't ask for and cannot express.
But the Book of Job reference goes even deeper, into the realm of raw nature. Jung points out that at the climax of the Book of Job, God finally appears to Job out of a whirlwind. And instead of giving a comforting theological explanation for suffering, God boasts about his terrifying creations.
Monsters.
Specifically focusing on two massive, untamable monsters, the behemoth and the leviathan. God talks in graphic detail about the behemoth's immense strength in his loins and his tail that moves like a massive cedar tree. Jung asks the obvious question: why is God, the creator of the moral universe, suddenly bragging to a suffering man about giant, muscular, terrifying monsters?
It seems so out of place.
Because God, in this specific psychological and mythological context, represents something far beyond human morality. He represents the untamable, boundless, terrifying, and awe-inspiring power of raw nature.
The wild energy.
He represents the completely unchained libido. God is showing Job that there are raw, elemental forces of creation and destruction in the universe that puny human morality and logical directed thinking simply cannot comprehend, let alone control.
That is a staggering image.
The behemoth, with the specific descriptions of its loins and its rigid tail, is an incredibly potent, almost overwhelmingly phallic symbol of raw, natural, generative energy. Miss Miller's unconscious mind is frantically drawing on this specific, terrifying biblical imagery because she is currently grappling with her own sudden, terrifying encounter with the raw, untamable force of her own sexual libido sparked by the officer.
This brings us to a massive foundational concept in Jungian psychology, the idea of the father imago. Miss Miller is using this grand, paternal, terrifying figure of God the Creator to process her very human feelings of lust and romance.
Right.
Why does the human mind do that?
Where?
Why elevate a guy on a boat to the creator of the universe?
It is a deeply ingrained biological and psychological defense mechanism. Let's look at human development. As an individual grows up, the transition from the safety of childhood into the chaotic reality of adult sexuality and true, vulnerable independence can be utterly terrifying.
It's a huge leap.
The responsibilities and the raw power of those biological drives are immense. Often, the conscious mind shrinks back from that responsibility, When it does, it regresses, and it takes those intense, frightening desires and transfers them onto safe, elevated, completely unattainable figures.
Like a protective shield.
In early childhood, this massive figure is literally the physical father who represents power and safety. But in adulthood, as the libido seeks new outlets, that energy is transferred to a psychological substitute, what Jung calls the father imago.
Which can take many forms.
This can be a priest, a much older mentor, or, in its ultimate most abstract form, God the Father. It's a psychological trick. It is a way for the individual to experience the intense rush of the emotion, the devotion, the awe, the love, without taking on any of the real-world risk of actual, physical, messy, human realization.
She gets the feeling without the danger.
Exactly. Miss Miller is taking the frightening sexual energy sparked by the real flesh and blood officer, and she is frantically handing it over to a safe, cosmic, untouchable father figure. She is saying, I don't desire this man. I am simply devoted to God.
And Jung takes this insight about Miss Miller, and he scales it up to encompass the entire globe. He argues that this isn't just an individual quirk of an American tourist. This exact mechanism of projection and sublimation is exactly how early religion functioned for all of ancient humanity.
Absolutely. If you look at the ancient world before the widespread structural adoption of moral frameworks like Christianity or philosophical Stoicism, society was largely ruled by unchained, brutal passions.
It was chaotic.
The libido that raw elan vital was often acted out in violent, purely instinctual, and highly destructive ways. Early Christianity and rival mystery religions like Mithraism didn't just succeed and spread because they were interesting philosophical debates.
They weren't just book clubs.
They succeeded because they were a desperate psychological evolutionary necessity for the survival of the species. They provided a vast cultural mechanism for the domestication of humanity.
They essentially gave millions of people a safe, structured place to put all that dangerous, civilization-destroying energy.
Exactly. By teaching people to project their inner conflicts, their raw lusts, and their violent passions outward onto a divine savior figure, or framing it as a cosmic spiritual struggle between abstract concepts of good and evil, society successfully prevented itself from tearing itself apart in a frenzy of base instincts.
Religion as a container.
The religious structure acted as a massive, necessary psychological container for the unchained libido. Miss Miller, in her ship's cabin, is doing exactly the same thing on a micro-individual level.
She's trying to contain her own storm.
She is instinctively using the structure of a grand religious hymn to contain and domesticate the sudden, terrifying surge of erotic energy she felt on the ship. She is desperately trying to sublimate the messy human desire into pure, safe spiritual devotion.
But here's the tragedy of Miss Miller and the reality of the human mind. The sublimation doesn't hold. The energy of the libido is simply too strong, or the religious container she built just isn't quite right for her. And we get to see this failure play out in real time in her writings. Because a little while later, she writes a second poem.
The next phase of the crisis.
Let's set the scene for the second piece of evidence. The sea voyage is over. Miss Miller is now on a hot, deeply uncomfortable, sleepless, and exhausting overnight train ride from Geneva to Paris. It is 4 a.m. She is drained.
Incredibly vulnerable.
In her compartment, she watches a moth fluttering around, violently throwing itself repeatedly against the glass to get to the light of the lamp. And inspired by this, she writes a poem titled The Song of the Moth.
The emotional tone of this second poem is a stark, shocking contrast to the first. The hymn of creation was hopeful, expansive, musical, and grand. It was a cosmic celebration. The Song of the Moth, however, is deeply melancholic, desperate, and fatalistic. In the poem, the moth speaks. It says it has longed for the eternal sun ever since it first crawled into consciousness.
Longing for the impossible.
It acknowledges that the sun is impossibly far away, but it says it will make one last desperate effort to fly up, approach the sun's unimaginable glory, gain one raptured glance of its fire, and then happily die in the attempt.
So what does this all mean? I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a second because I can hear the listener thinking it. She's on a terrible train ride. It's 4 a.m. She's probably horribly sleep-deprived. Isn't it entirely possible that she just saw a bug hitting a lamp, felt sorry for it, and wrote a literal, slightly depressing poem about a bug? Why does this have to be a profound psychological shift?
It is a fair question, and it is exactly what Miss Miller's conscious mind wants you to think. But psychoanalysis relies on the principle that psychological complexes hold on to their energy fiercely.
They don't just vanish.
The mind does not simply drop a profound conflict because the scenery changes. The first poem, The Grand Hymn, was a massive attempt at sublimation, trying to permanently solve her very real erotic conflict through religious, spiritual elevation. But that attempt failed.
The container broke.
The libido, the life force, is no longer satisfied with safe, abstract religious metaphors. It is hungry. It is now demanding actual material reality. It wants the blistering heat of the actual sun, not just the intellectual concept of the god of light.
It wants to burn.
The moth in the poem isn't just a bug. It is a projection of her own exhausted, desperate libido, realizing that spiritual sublimation is starving her of real life.
And that demand for reality, that desire to touch the actual sun, is incredibly dangerous. The text actually compares the moth in her poem directly to the protagonist of Goethe's masterpiece, Faust.
The Faustian parallel Jung draws here is incredibly apt, and it unlocks the true depth of her despair. If you recall the story, Faust was a brilliant scholar who lived a life of total, miserable asceticism and intellectual pursuit.
All brain, no body.
He spent his entire life in his study, surrounded by books. He longed for the infinite, for the divine, for pure knowledge, but he grew to utterly loathe his own world-renouncing life because it entirely denied his physical, passionate animal nature. He realized he had learned everything, but experienced nothing.
The ultimate intellectual trap.
When he finally breaks under the psychological pressure, he makes a literal deal with the devil to finally experience the material world, to feel lust, power, and passion. He embraces the fire of reality, but in doing so, he burns his wings completely. He destroys Marguerite, the innocent woman he loves, and he ultimately damns his own soul.
So the moth, repeatedly flying into the burning light on the train, is Faust throwing himself into damnation for a taste of real life.
Yes. The moth represents the crushing, paralyzing weight of the modern human conflict. We, as modern civilized people, are constantly torn between two terrifying extremes. On one side is the Scylla of total world renunciation.
Which means rejecting reality.
This is living purely in the intellect, in the spirit, obeying every moral rule, but entirely denying the body and its passions. It is safe, but it is bloodless. On the other side is the Charybdis of total world acceptance.
Local chaos.
This means giving oneself over completely to unchained passion, acting on every erotic impulse and being completely consumed and destroyed by it, just like the moth bursting into flame when it finally touches the lamp.
Ms. Miller's poem is an incredibly tragic expression of this agonizing choice. She desperately wants the sun. She wants the warmth of real, messy human love and physical passion that the officer represented.
She's terrified of it.
But she knows, deep in her strictly conditioned soul, that getting too close to that reality will completely destroy her current moral, social, and psychological framework. To actually touch the fire of her own desire is, to her current identity, to die.
And just like with the first poem, where she tried to hide behind Milton in Anaxagoras, Miss Miller tries her hardest to consciously dismiss how deep and dark this moth poem really is.
She tries to play it off again.
She adds a little footnote to the poem in her journal, quoting Edgar Allan Poe's famous poem, The Raven. She quotes the specific line, "Only this and nothing more." She's trying to wink at the audience and say, it was just a moth on a train, folks. Nothing to see here. I'm just being poetic.
It is a fascinatingly flawed defense mechanism. A total failure of her conscious censorship. Because if you know Poe's The Raven, you know the entire context of that specific line.
It's the ultimate giveaway.
The line, "Only this and nothing more," is spoken by the terrified narrator as he desperately tries to convince himself that the creepy tapping at his chamber door is just the wind. But in reality, it is the spectral raven, coming from the underworld to relentlessly torment him over his lost, dead, impossible love, Lenore.
The buried truth knocking on the door.
The raven's ultimate driving message is nevermore. So by casually quoting that specific poem to dismiss her feelings, she is entirely unconsciously admitting the exact truth. She is admitting that she is haunted by a lost love, by an impossible desire, and by the terrifying knowledge that her current path leads only to nevermore.
As Jung constantly, relentlessly reminds us throughout this text, the unconscious is never just anything. Every single symbol, every literary reference, every seemingly random thought is loaded with profound, revealing meaning.
It's like your brain is desperately trying to lie to you, but it accidentally uses the exact truth to construct the lie. It's brilliant and terrifying.
It really is.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and recap the incredible, sprawling journey we've been on today. We started by exploring Hinkle's profound idea that psychoanalysis acts as a literal surgery for the soul, taking the scalpel to heal the hidden, crippling scars of our minds that nature left behind,
We saw how Jung fundamentally broke away from Freud.
expanding the very definition of the libido from just narrow sexual hunger into a massive cosmic life energy, and the elan vital that drives our growth, our art, and our survival.
We examined the mechanics of the mind, how our brains constantly oscillate between the exhausting, logical, modern labor of directed thought and the ancient, effortless, myth-making machinery of fantasy thought.
We learned about regression.
We learned that when we hit a wall or an obstacle in our present lives, our life energy regresses, flowing backward to create infantile fantasies that directly mirror the sweeping myths of ancient humanity.
And finally, we tracked that entire complex psychological process in real time through the tragic, revealing writings of Miss Frank Miller. We saw how a seemingly minor, easily dismissible interaction with a singing naval officer was undervalued by her strict, conscious mind, only to violently explode in her unconscious.
The return of the repressed.
Her repressed desires cloaked themselves in the grand symbols of world creation, the suffering of the Book of Job, and finally the tragic, fatalistic longing of a moth drawn to a burning sun. Her story definitively proved that our unacknowledged passions and ignored energies will always, eventually, force their way to the surface, one way or another.
This raises an important question for everyone listening to this deep dive right now. We all have daydreams. We all have moments where our minds wander away from the spreadsheet, the email, or the conversation at hand.
Where do you go when things get hard?
When you face a severe obstacle today, a difficult conversation with a partner, a major career setback, or a profound personal loss, where does your mind go? Is your mind actively retreating into fantasies of the past? Are you playing out elaborate, heroic scenarios in your head where you are universally loved, perfectly understood, and wildly successful?
Recognizing that you are doing this isn't a failure.
Not at all. You shouldn't feel ashamed of it. According to Jung, recognizing this regression is the very first vital step to unlocking what he calls your perspective potency.
Perspective potency. I want to spend some real time on this before we go because it feels like the ultimate actionable takeaway from all this heavy theory. What exactly does that mean for the listener? How do they use it?
Perspective potency is the light at the end of the psychoanalytic tunnel. It means taking that massive reservoir of mental energy, that dammed up libido that is currently wasting away, spinning its wheels in regressive, useless fantasies about the past or impossible futures, and consciously reclaiming it.
Putting it to work.
It means recognizing the fantasy for what it is, a symbol of an unfulfilled need, and redirecting that raw energy to actually create your future in reality.
It means stopping the retreat from the present moment.
If you are constantly daydreaming about being respected and powerful because you feel weak at your job, perspective potency means understanding that your mind is screaming for agency.
So you take action.
You then take the energy you spend on the daydream and you apply it to updating your resume, learning a new skill, or having that terrifying conversation with your boss. You use the knowledge of your own unconscious desires to move forward in reality, rather than hiding in the luminous mist of fantasy.
That is incredibly empowering. It turns your daydreams from a sign of weakness into a diagnostic tool for your own life. And it leaves us with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over as we end this journey.
Something to take away.
We've talked extensively today about how the human mind still contains the entire evolutionary history of our species. From the primal animal cries of monkeys and dogs that Anatole France mentioned, to the grand, sweeping mythologies of ancient Greece, Rome, and the biblical epics.
The architecture is still there.
But the world has changed drastically since Jung wrote this, and since humanity looked up at the sun in awe. We live in an era of artificial intelligence, global interconnectedness, and virtual reality. So, what entirely new modern myths are our unconscious minds currently drafting right now?
It's a fascinating question.
How is the deep, ancient mythological architecture of our brains the exact same architecture that created the sun gods and the Leviathan, creating new symbolic stories to help us survive the unprecedented anxieties, the information overload, and the complexities of the digital age?
What does the mythology of the internet, of algorithms, and of global surveillance look like inside our nightly dreams?
That is the new, uncharted frontier of the unconscious today. The symbols change, but the ancient machinery driving them remains exactly the same.
Beautifully said.
We want to thank you so much for taking this profound, deep dive with us today. Keep questioning your daydreams. Keep looking for the hidden symbols in your own life. And always remember that the most unexplored, terrifying, and endlessly fascinating territory left on Earth is the one sitting right between your ears.